hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were forcibly deported through Russia from Ukrainian territory. Many have experienced terrible things like the filtration camps on the borders, separation from families, cruel interrogations by the Russian troops, and, of course, being forced to live in another country, an enemy country, without money or documents in many cases, left stranded and struggling to leave Russia by themselves. Some, like children, do not even have the option to try to return home or to go to Europe. Russia has shamelessly shown children being brainwashed to believe their country is wrong in resisting Russian aggression, and to position Russia as their liberator. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce, and our material is now available on the popular podcast platforms as well. Ksenia Terkova is a journalist and a linguist with a PhD in philology, language and literature. She has both Russian and Ukrainian backgrounds and has worked in both countries for private as well as independent media. Her specialist area of research is studying media texts and propaganda. Ksenia is a guest lecturer at American universities and also runs a YouTube channel which offers analysis of the current events from the point of view of the nuances of language. And Ksenia, this is your second time on the channel, and I'm really pleased to welcome you back.
Thanks for having me.
And we're going to tackle what is a really tough topic today, and it's about the theft, the abduction of children from Ukraine, how they're treated. But of course, we're also going to touch on how children in Russia are also treated and used for propaganda purposes. And this isn't an easy topic. We've covered it now in 2 or 3 videos on the channel. But I think every time it's very tough to record these, and I think it's difficult for the audience to listen to these stories, but it's absolutely essential to do that, isn't it?
Yes, it's one of the topics I'm very much into, because it's kind of a personal topic for me, because I have an adopted son, adopted in Russia, and he was adopted in 2010, 2 years before the law of Dima Yakovlev, which was a law, the symmetrical so-called answer to Magnitsky law, when this law was signed in Russia. So it became kind of a personal, very personal topic for me. So I follow all the news, and I do some research, and I interview people. So I usually it's one of the topics I cover for Voice of America, or for like places I work for.
And the last time we covered this topic, it was before the ICC issued its sort of warrant for the arrest of Putin, but also significantly Lvova Belova. And this is a really critical moment, and it's helping to shine a light, isn't it, on this terrible part of the Russo-Ukrainian war.
Well, I think we see the results already, because after that warrant was issued, actually Russia started returning kids to Ukraine, some of them, because a huge amount of kids is still in Russia. The kids who were basically stolen from Ukraine, from their parents, from the families, but they started that process slowly. And I think that was the role that warrant played. And I talked to the lawyer the French lawyer who initiated that warrant, and he told me the same thing, that in his opinion it helped. We saw it almost immediately. The next week, or in next several days, some kids were returned to Ukraine. So although in Russia they said that it doesn't have any sense for them, they are not going to obey that warrant, and it doesn't play any significant role. I think it does play some role, and it shows us by what happened, because they started returning kids.
Do we have a sense of how many children were taken from Ukraine? And do we have sense of where they are and, what the challenge is going to be actually returning them? Because, they may not have all the details of, the families and locations of these children.
Yes, it's very difficult to locate them because for a lot of children, Russian authorities, they change their names, they change their documents, they change their environment and geographical location. So it's very difficult to understand where they are. And the numbers also are different because it's difficult to count. As far as I understood, now they are talking about, the Ukrainian authorities are talking about 20,000 kids moved to Russia. But again, it's very hard to say. It's very hard to find out the particular number. And several days ago, an independent Russian-speaking media outlet, Important Stories, that is labeled as a foreign agent by the Russian government, published an investigation, a big article dedicated to those kids, and they went through the state database on orphans and children left without parental care. There is that huge government resource, that database, and I used it when I was a parent to be, when I was about to adopt a child. So you go, when your paperwork is done, you go to that base and you look for children and from different Russian regions. And the journalists from that media outlet, Important Stories, they found out, so they did a research and they found out that the last year there was a spike in the number of kids appeared in that base. And that spike was about 2,500 children, so 2,500 children about. And of course, we cannot say that 100% of them are Ukrainians, that all of them were stolen from Ukraine. But obviously, that spike shows us that something was going on, and the journalist found some particular children who were from Ukraine. So they found some proof, and they came to the conclusion that maybe the majority of those kids are from Ukraine. That's why they had that big spike. The system does not involve finding Ukrainian relatives of these children to take them into custody. And in fact, Russia does not provide an opportunity for the children to remain in Ukraine. So for those children who appeared in that database, they don't even mention that they are from Ukraine. Some of them you can find that information, but they are not trying to find the Ukrainian relatives or Ukrainian families. So the authorities are trying to push Russian people to adopt Ukrainian children.
And some of these children will have lost their parents potentially in the war, but others will have parents and relatives who are, trying to track them down. And I think that is one of the tragedies of this, is these children may have been told all sorts of stories about how the state doesn't want them, about how their parents and families don't want them, and of course how the Ukrainian state is, evil, and all these sort of stories. Do we know anecdotally, or do we have any evidence of what these children are being told when they either get into state care or into private families within Russia?
Yes, there is some proof, because some of those children, as I said before, were returned to Ukraine, and they told their stories. So from them, we know what they are doing to children there, and they do in those camps, what they call camps of rehabilitation, centers, or because they put a lot of kids for into so-called summer camps, and telling them they will return to Ukraine after that. But a lot of those kids after the summer camps never returned. Or some of them were put into some rehabilitation facilities or something like that. Some kids, they found their foster families. Some of them were adopted, because we can't talk about like legal adoption in those circumstances, because it's legal in Russia, but it's not legal for the rest of the world. And those children who returned to Ukraine, they told some stories that it's known that they were put into Russian school, for example, to study Russian language. So all Ukrainian kids, just to understand the situation, all Ukrainian kids, they study in Ukrainian schools in Ukrainian language. So they don't even know the Russian terminology, for example, in math or in science or in other different subjects. So when you put a Ukrainian kid into the Russian school, that kid won't understand anything unless their family language was Russian. But still, it would be difficult because at school they didn't learn like Russian grammar, and it was not a common thing, except those kids who were homeschooling. So it's yes, it's shaping some different identity. It's taking the Ukrainian identity and putting the Russian identity instead, or they forced them to sing a Russian anthem, and they had a lot of kids. They had like patriotic lessons, because in every Russian school they have now weekly lessons called that talks about important things, and usually they talk about so-called special operation, or they called about Western countries, how bad they are, or about Ukraine, or about some patriotic things, like Russia is a great country, and something like that, traditional values. So they had those patriotic lessons. Some of them met Russian military people, Russian soldiers, who came to give some speeches, and who told how they served in the special operation. And some of those kids were weaving camouflage nets for the Russian soldiers. So it's I can't even imagine what could be in the heads of those kids. So if you are a Ukrainian kid, you speak Ukrainian, you go to Ukrainian school, and then suddenly you are, for example, you are in Russia, you go to Russian school, they force you to speak Russian language, sing Russian anthem, and your world is like upside down, because now they told you that Ukrainians are bad and Russians are good, and they will save you, and they force you to weave those nets for Russian soldiers. So it's horrible. It's just killing people's identity, and I think there is some genocidal. It's a genocidal thing. It's not maybe qualified yet like that, but that, by the way, that French lawyer told me that they consider it as a sign of genocide, cultural genocide, what they do to Ukrainian kids.
And there seems to be, I mean, I was at an event just last week, and there were some sort of academic historians there, and they're very hesitant to use the term genocide. And yet, if you look at this action that's taking place, and clearly the ICC has issued a warrant because of the genocidal nature of what's taking place. It's not simply a crime, it's a crime that has far greater sort of depth and implications to it. But if you take all the criteria of a genocide, including attacks on civilian infrastructure, torture chambers, all this kind of stuff, there are clear signs, numerous signs, that these criteria, every single criteria that would constitute genocide, are being met. And yet the media and academics are extremely hesitant to put that label on it, in the same way that they've been very hesitant for many years to label the Holodomor as a genocide. And yet Ukrainian academics will not have quite the same reservations there about using these labels. Do you think this is still an issue? I mean, are Western academics and media far too timid in some ways, still appeasing Russia?
I think now it's they are less hesitant maybe than before, and that word appears more and more in the Western media and in the Ukrainian media, of course. And as far as I understood from talking to experts, they see the genocidal nature because they are trying to erase their identity. If you take your name, they change your paperwork. They take you out of the family. They change your language. They change the system of your views, how you see the world. And I think it's erasing your identity, and that's why it's seen now as a genocidal nature.
And to clarify again here, so clearly these children then are, if they find themselves with other Ukrainian children or Ukrainian speakers, are they discouraged from speaking Ukrainian? Are they discouraged from reading Ukrainian? And something you mentioned there is also quite traumatizing, the idea that they would have to Russify their names as well. So you think, oh, this is all definitely a core part of what's happening.
Well, I think they changed their names because they just want to hide the kids. But as for the language, I don't know exactly what they tell children who want to speak Ukrainian, because in propaganda they say that we are not against Ukrainian language. We let them speak Ukrainian. We would be happy if they speak their native language. We are not against it, not at all. So they are trying to show that they are very open and tolerant towards those kids. So they are not forcing them to forget their own language. But at the same time, they are saying that those kids, they need to learn Russian better. And even Russian authorities say that openly. They need to learn Russian better. They need to catch up with Russian because their Russian is not very good, like learning Russian grammar, singing Russian songs and stuff like that. And so although they show their intentions towards Ukrainian language as good, on the other hand, they are showing it as they are showing that attitude towards Ukrainian as some second sort language. So our first goal, they say, is to make them learn Russian. And to go to the Russian school, to get Russian passports, and to study Russian culture. And if they want, of course, we are not against it. They can speak Ukrainian. So that attitude, they want to show themselves as very generous and good, kind people. But in that narrative, we see the real attitude towards Ukrainian language. It's some secondary language. They can speak it. We are not against it. But Russian is the main thing, and it's also, I think, it's terrible. It's terrible.
And we're fairly sure, aren't we, that in most cases, the parents either would not have given permission for the children to leave, or they would have given permission for them to attend these camps temporarily and be returned home. So, is it true that we don't think anyone has given permission for these children to stay in Russia, and certainly not for them to be re-educated?
Oh, of course, no, I don't think any of them got some official permission about those kids. No, I don't think so. And the situations with those kids are very different. As you said, some of them lost their parents because of the war. So parents were killed or died because of the war. Some of the parents were arrested by Russian military forces or pro-Russian in the occupied Donbass, for example. And so they detained the parent, and they sent kids to Russia. And there were stories like that in Ukrainian media and in the Western media. So the situations are very different with those kids.
And that's incredibly tragic, isn't it? A situation like that. Uh, Almost in some instances, you fear that the parents detained because they've got children that can be taken. Do we know what kind of areas they're from? Would this be Kherson, sort of Mariupol area, or is it from right across? I mean, Kharkiv was retaken, but do we know, before it was retaken, were children taken from that region, for instance?
Yes, they were taken from different regions, and as far as I understand, now they are evacuating children from Zaporizhia region. And so before the counteroffensive, I guess, so they're trying to evacuate the children, and that's what was happening in other different regions. And in the orphanages, for example, and in the different children facilities, some doctors were trying to hide children, and some of them hid children. So they were trying to avoid the situation when the children would be forcefully sent to Russia. And yes, there are from different regions. As for the situation when the parent was detained and the children were about to be adopted, it was a real story about a parent, a father from Mariupol, and he was detained. And while he was detained, his children were in Russia in that summer camp, and they told them that they would be adopted. And so somehow they reached out to him, and they told him, like, you have 5 days, otherwise we will be adopted. And finally they reconnected. So those stories are real. When we have parents, we have family, but kids are still being sent to Russia, and they want to put them in different Russian families.
And that case, I read that one you talked about. Now, the father in this case went through an extraordinary amount of bureaucracy. I mean, he pushed incredibly hard. And that story obviously has ended positively. But the amount of time, expense, and effort he had to go through to actually even reach them and then be allowed to take them home. I mean, that is the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? Many children will not have either relatives with the means to do that. Many will not have parents or relatives that are as resourceful or able to sort of push against that bureaucratic machine. So these stories are heartening, but for the majority of children, it potentially is going to be far harder to reconnect them with their relatives and with their country.
Oh, of course, and we don't know the numbers again. It's very difficult to figure out what the numbers are. And another category is children from the orphanages who are real orphans. And it's known that they moved the whole orphanages from the occupied territories, for example, or the territories that were occupied and then deoccupied. So they moved the whole facilities, the whole children facilities, and those children, there are a lot of orphans in Russia. And although people do adopt children in Russia, it's still there are still a lot of orphans. So they add to those orphans Ukrainian children, Ukrainian orphans. They're trying to motivate people artificially to adopt children. They're trying to, Russian officials, I mean, Russian government, they're trying to stimulate them. Like, we will give you money. They are doing this adoption propaganda. And so they push people to adopt, and it happened before the war. It's not something that is happening only now. So they push people to adopt, but what happens then in different Russia's regions that are not very rich, people sometimes, unfortunately, adopt kids to get money from the government, and so they're not. They don't feel like they want to adopt. They're not prepared for that. They're not ready for that as parents, as families. Psychologists don't work with them. And I don't know about now. I think now it's more difficult. But when I adopted, the process was very easy. So my point is that people adopt children and then they return them to the orphanages. And the numbers of returning children are huge in Russia. There are some researchers who say that the numbers of returning are very big. So now they add to that huge amount of Russian orphanages, they add stolen Ukrainian orphans. And I don't know what is the purpose. Why do they need those kids? Who will adopt them? And wouldn't it be like it was before, as I said, with the Russian children? Maybe they will push people to adopt, and they will adopt return children, or something else will happen. So it doesn't make any sense. First of all, it's not legal according to the international law. But even if we are talking just about like practical things, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have any logic for me. If you have so many orphans, you need to deal with your own orphans. Why do you want to steal the kids from other countries? But they picture it as a how they they use that special language. They say that when they occupy Ukrainian cities, they say that they liberate them. And now about the children, they say that they are saving Ukrainian children, that they are taking care of them. So they are picturing themselves as rescuers, as saviors, as for example, that woman, Maria Lvova Belova, she is a hero in Russian propaganda. They picture her as a hero who is saving little kids, always wants to help, and she has a lot of kids herself adopted, and her biological kids. So I just don't know why do they need it.
And this takes us back, I think, to the genocidal rhetoric. I mean, first of all, maybe they think that this, kidnapping of children, maybe that creates terror or fear, and they think, like the bombing of energy infrastructure in Ukrainian cities, maybe they think that it serves some purpose as a terror weapon. But it seems to me even worse than that, from what you're saying here, is that they may also see these children as not Ukrainians, but as Russians that have gone bad, and this is part of the rhetoric we hear from many of the TV propagandists. Ukrainians are the same as Russians, just something's gone wrong in their heads. You know, they're misguided. They've become Nazis. They've become this, that.
Right. And those kids, by the way, who returned to Ukraine, they told stories how they were bullied by Russian kids because they were Ukrainians.
Yes, I mean that has a long history, doesn't it? The pressure on children to not speak Ukrainian was strong during the Soviet period, and using tools like embarrassment, mockery, ridicule, and looking at both Ukrainian language and literature as sort of not just secondary, but almost like a sort of peasant language rather than a high civilized cultured language. But if you take that kind of prejudice, historic prejudice, and then combine it with what we're hearing from the propagandists, which is that almost, Ukrainians need to be converted, need to be turned back into good Russians or else eliminated. I mean, these are some of the phrases that only recently we've heard on Solovyov and even Simonyan and these kind of people on their shows. Do you think this abduction and reprogramming of children sort of fits in with what we're hearing in other areas?
Yes, it fits in what we hear in other areas, but for me, it doesn't add up with that rhetoric I just was talking about. When they say that we're saving Ukrainian children, let's help them. They're suffering from war, from their Nazi government, and let's help them. It doesn't. There is a contradictory between those two parts of that two parts of propaganda narrative about Ukraine, because if you 24 hours per day you are talking about how bad Ukraine is, how bad Ukrainian people are, Ukrainian language doesn't exist, and they're all Nazis, and so on. And then, for example, let's imagine some average Russian kid who is watching TV with his family, with their family. And so they are watching those TV channels. They are listening to all those narratives about Ukraine and the Ukrainians. And then suddenly they go to school and figures out that they put a couple of Ukrainian kids in their class. What would be the reaction after that? I don't think the kid, especially if it's a teenager, because it's a difficult time, the difficult age. I don't think that a kid will be very kind to those Ukrainian kids, and there is a high risk of bullying. So it's a contradictory. It doesn't make any logic. So one narrative doesn't support another narrative of propaganda, and we see the real intention and the real thoughts of Russian government of Ukraine and Ukrainian people and Ukrainian children in particular.
And of course, Russian children themselves are subject to fairly intense propagandizing, aren't they? Now, from kindergarten onwards, we see children being used to make sort of Z patterns and dress as tanks and all this kind of stuff. Now, this sort of thing has sort of always gone on, and it was big in the Soviet Union, but it seems to have been intensified over the last year, the militarization of education. So what can we tell about what's actually going on in Russian schools?
I think it started not a year ago, not after the full-scale war against Ukraine started. It started after the annexation of Crimea. And I remember that time very well, because I moved to Ukraine from Russia to Ukraine in 2013, but I was visiting my family in Russia very often. So I went to Russia pretty often during 2014, 2015 years, and I do remember that wave of militarization and what they called victory frenzy, победобесие, in Russian language. That is something that actually, as far as I know, as far as I understand, didn't exist in Soviet Union. There was some respect to that, for example, to that Victory Day, and to the the victory in World War II, which they called Great Patriotic War in Russia. But there was nothing but respect. But after the annexation of Crimea, they needed that narrative about Russian politicians. Putin, they needed that narrative to take it out. Narrative about Great Patriotic War. Russians are a great nation, and they won that war. So they needed it to they needed it to tell the people why, to support some propaganda narratives about the annexation of Crimea, and that's when that all started. A lot of tanks on the Moscow streets before the parade, the rehearsals, and sometimes it was scary, even scary, and the level of militarization. They started dressing kids, and that very small kids, even like very small kids in the military uniform, making tanks out of everything, out of Russian bliny food and something like that. So the level of militarization and that victory frenzy got to some absurdity. That the level of that absurdity was incredible. And now they are still using that old narrative. They're still using that resource, propaganda resource of Great Patriotic War. And they create those new symbols, Z and V, and they line up kids in the shape of Z, when in the shape of V. They have some special lessons, as I said before, at school, some talks with the Russian soldiers, and so on. So they push that narrative, that militarization, even harder than it was before. But it started, I think, after the annexation of Crimea.
And while we're talking about this propagandizing, another very disturbing aspect of what we've seen is Ukrainian children being used in propaganda spectacles, either sort of filmed or interviewed. There was one last week with Ukrainian children being forced to sit down with a Russian military officer and basically being told that, they were liberated, essentially liberated by their captors, liberated by the people who destroyed their cities and killed their relatives. That's disturbing. But also a couple of months ago, we had Ukrainian children appearing in a stadium in Moscow. Again, huge pressure on these children. In this case, it was from Mariupol, which has been destroyed really to its foundations. This also fits. The Geneva Convention states that you're not allowed to parade soldiers in this way, and here we have children being used as sort of material for propaganda. What's your reaction when you see these things? And for you, do they also fit this criteria of genocidal behavior?
Yes, I think it fits this criteria, and I think it's extremely cruel. to kids, not only kidnap them and erase their identity, but also use them as a propaganda tool. But they use Russian kids as well as a propaganda tool all the time. And in general, they use Putin uses children as a tool all the time. And has been using them for many years, maybe since that law was adopted, Dima Yakovlev law. And they manipulate kids. They are threatening parents, Russian anti-war parents who are expressing their anti-war views. Sometimes they're threatening them that they will take the kids away. So children for children for the Russian government, for the Russian regime, is just a tool to support the propaganda narratives, to create some images they need at a certain time. So they use children as a tool all the time in different situations. And there was a very important story, I think maybe you followed that story, about Masha Moskaleova, a Russian teenager who drew an anti-war picture with the Ukrainian flag. And it was just a peaceful picture. There was nothing, no hate speech against Russian people or anything like that. There was a Ukrainian flag and something about the peace, and she wants the war to stop. And the teacher at school, she reported her that she drew that picture. So after that, the process started. They against her father. And she lived with a single dad because her parents were divorced a long time ago, and mother left them many years ago. And actually, the mother didn't show any interest in Masha's life, and they were not communicating, and so she lived with her dad. So they started a process against her dad. They found some his anti-war statements on social media. And finally, he was sentenced to I forgot to how many years in prison, but there was a sentence his father Alexei received as a result of that story. Then he managed to escape to somewhere, but unfortunately he was detained in Belarus, and now where Alexei is, nobody knows. And they put Masha into so first of all, they wanted to put her into orphanage. And there was a huge resonance because if people in Russia, although a lot of them are apathetic, they are not interested, as they say, they're not interested in politics. They're trying to stay away from the political questions. When it has to do with kids, Russian society kind of wakes up a little bit. And I saw it many times with Dima Yakovlev law, because even those people who were not in opposition, were very apathetic again, they stood up and they went to the protest, because when it has to do with kids, they want to stand up. And there was a big resonance again about this story. So finally, that woman, Maria Lvova-Belova, got involved into the story, and Masha ended up in her mother's family, but nobody knows what really happened. Because obviously her mom didn't want to take her. And according to what I know, to people I talked to the lawyers, they say that it's highly likely that the local authorities from that region, they were told to arrange that somehow. And maybe they gave her money, or I don't know how they what they told her. Nobody knows, and I don't want to speculate on that. But we know that Masha ended up in that family, in the family of her mom. And again, they were not even communicating before. And the pictures after that, they published a couple of pictures, and they looked a little bit strange. And I know that some activists were trying to call Masha, but the mom didn't want her to talk to anyone. So nobody actually knows what is going on there. That is a very, very good illustration of what Russian authorities and Russian government are doing with kids and how they're using it as a tool. Because after that, I think the parents, single parents, or the parents, for example, with adopted kids, and I know from my friends that they're thinking about it. So they will think, I should be very cautious in what I say, what I publish, what I like on social media, because they can come and take away my kids. That's how they manipulate families and children, and they make children hostages out of children.
And we've seen that in previous years, even before the full-scale war. We've seen that parents who go to a protest and take their children have actually had their children taken away from them by Russian social services. So there is this threat that we can essentially kidnap your children. We can take them away and punish you for any political activism. Well, I think the area I'd like to sort of end on is Ukraine is now contemplating victory. We don't know when that will come. We don't know what form that will take or how complete that victory will be. But many Ukrainians have told me that they will not get a sense that they're victorious until they've got all of the kids back. But what are the chances? It seems to me that it's going to be very difficult to get them all back. And it's going to be very difficult to unite them with, with friends, family, relatives, and guardians. And some of them, as in case in the orphanages, they don't have any of those connections either. And the institutions which they used to live in may well have been destroyed in the fighting. So this is going to be a very difficult phase of any Ukrainian victory, isn't it?
Yes, that's true. And all the experts I talked to, including that French lawyer Emmanuel Daoud, who initiated that arrest warrant against Maria Lvova-Belova and Putin, they say that it will be extremely difficult because Russians have changed the children's names already, some of them. So it will be, and they also send them to different regions. So it will be difficult to locate them. But again, there are different groups of children. There are children who are not orphans. They have families, and the international activists and lawyers and society just in general can help those families to reunite. As for the orphans, it's a different situation, and it's more difficult in my opinion. But it's also very important to try to do everything to get the orphans back. And one of the reasons is Dima Yakovlev law, because according to Dima Yakovlev law, in foreign parents, especially parents from families from the United States, cannot adopt Russian children. So the chances of being adopted decreased significantly for those children, for those orphans in Russia. For Russian orphans, they were already low because they cannot be adopted by the American families, but they take those chances from Ukrainian kids as well, who could be adopted by the American families. And it's known that American families have been adopting Ukrainian kids and Russian kids before Dima Yakovlev law, with some serious health issues. That kind of issues that in Russia they cannot deal with, and a lot of Russian families, they just cannot adopt kids like that because they don't have enough money. They don't know, there is a lot of prejudice, stereotypes in the society, because society will treat them bad, and they don't have any emotional, financial resource for that. But the American parents used to adopt them, and now they, with the annexation of Crimea, they took those chances from the Crimean kids, from the orphans from Donbass, and now from other Ukrainian regions. So it's very important to get those kids back. But as you said, I agree, it will be very, very difficult, because if they change the names and the location and all the paperwork, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. But that's why I think it's very important that a lot of journalists from Ukraine and from Russia, I mean, they are outside Russia now, but they're still working on investigating those cases, and there are a lot of investigations being published, and I think it's a very, very important part of that work to get kids back.
And that's why I think, conversations like this are so important, because this topic does not get the sort of coverage in the media which I think it deserves. It's an absolutely tragic story, and I think it's something that every single Ukrainian is acutely aware of, that these children need to be returned, and that is a key part of their eventual victory in this war. Well, Ksenia, thank you so much for going through this really tough topic with us. And as this story unfolds, as hopefully more children return, then it'd be good to return back to this topic and get a progress update in a couple of months.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.